Hello, good evening everyone, and welcome to the Mayoral and London Institute at Queen Mary University of London. My name is Dr. Patrick Diamond. I'm the director of the Mayoral and London Institute, and we're delighted to welcome you here with us this evening to discuss the future of the Conservative Party in London. The session this evening will be chaired by Jenna Goldberg and will include a polling presentation from Lewis Baston, who's going to talk about recent election results in London. And then we'll have some remarks from Andrew Boff, the Right Honourable Justine Greening, Stephen Hammond MP, and Professor Tony Travers from the London School of Economics. And we'll introduce each of the panellists fully in a moment. I'd like, though, to introduce our chair for this evening, Jenna Goldberg. Jenna is board director at the London Communications Agency and a member of their management team. She leads projects across the public and private sectors in London, advising FTSE 100 developers, local authorities and housing associations on corporate communications, campaigns, consultation and engagement. Thank you so much, Jenna, for joining us this evening and agreeing to chair what we think should be a lively and really interesting discussion. So thanks again to all the panelists. Thanks to you for joining us. And let me hand over now to Jenna, who's going to lead tonight's discussion. Jenna.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for having me. And I think this is probably the world's easiest gig because we've got such a brilliant panel of such interesting people. I don't think I'm going to have to do very much, which is quite exciting. And I'm looking forward to hearing from all of them as well as from all of our audience, who I would encourage to ask questions in the Q&A box when that moment comes. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our sort of keynote speaker, if you like, if you remember those old days where we used to gather in conference rooms and have keynote speeches, which today is Lewis Baston, who I'm sure many of you know. He's a writer, a historian, a political analyst and journalist. I'm sure many of you have read his work on London and other websites as well as his own, on sort of politics and particularly the kind of politics of London as a city and the history of politics in London. So you don't need to hear any more from me. I'm going to hand over to Lewis for a short presentation and then we'll hear in turn from each of our panellists after that. Over to you, Lewis.
Well, thank you very much, Jenna, and thanks everyone for letting me into a sort of discussion between Conservatives. I'm going to basically try and sort of set out where we are and leave the future to you. I've got one or two ideas that I'll share, but I shall start when the technology allows by telling a tale of two elections, two comfortable Conservative victories on the national scene. The general election of 1987, Margaret Thatcher's third term, a very blue map of London. And then 2019, a very similar election result in lots of ways, a Conservative lead over Labour of a similar margin nationally in terms of share of the vote. On the other hand, in London, you've got a very different picture. So toggling between the two shows that there's been sort of 30 years of decline, as it were, for the Conservatives in London. So I think that's sort of a simple way of just showing what the problem is, that a national landslide used to produce a big Conservative swathe across London and reduce Labour to a few sort of working class and ethnically diverse areas in the inner city. Now the Conservatives are pushed to the fringe, even when they do well in a national election. So part of the thing you'll get from that is that London has not always been a Labour city. Some people say this now, but it's not actually true. It's very sort of revisionist. The first time really that the Labour won London but lost the rest of the country was 2010. Before then, the Conservatives used to win London, sometimes by a larger margin than they won the vote across Great Britain. In the 80s and 90s, the Thatcher governments were bolstered by high share of the vote in London, 45, 46%, and dominant position in seats. Since 1997, it's basically flatlined. The Conservative share has remained around in the low 30s. And this contrasts with the large increase in the Conservative share of the vote in the rest of the country. And the main source of swing of movements between the parties has tended to be movements between Labour and third parties, squeezing the Lib Dems in 2015, losing votes to the Lib Dems in 2005, and of course some shuffling around with the political shifts that have happened within London. But in general, it's a fairly stagnant situation for the vote. And I mean, this chart, it may be may need a little explanation. I've separated out London and the rest of England in this and contrasted just the Conservative lead over Labour since 1974, when the constituencies first line up with the Greater London boundary. London's always been a little bit more Labour than the rest of England, but not massively so. It's a gap of sort of 5-7 points in lead. Ever since 2010, it's opened up sort of hugely. So there's now, in 2019, you've got this 34-point difference in the lead between the Labour and Conservative in London compared to the rest of England. Now, there's a lot more of the rest of England, so obviously the Conservatives are ahead on aggregate. Drilling down a bit further into London, this is what happened. This is the party's share of councillors since the London boroughs were established in 1964. 2018 was pretty much was the worst set of elections ever for the Conservatives from that point of view. 2022 might, on current performance, be a little better. If you sort of extrapolate the mayoral elections onto this, you probably end up with a net gain of sort of 50 to 100 seats. Although it's less than it was, of course, there are a number of secure places where the Conservatives will win. There's, I think, 5 or 6 boroughs where pretty much they will always be in control. Bromley, Bexley, Kensington and Chelsea, Hillingdon, probably, Westminster, almost certainly, and Havering, where they're the kind of centre party in the political system between sort of parties that are further right and residents and so on. So the Conservatives won't be kind of driven out of London. There are these sort of strongholds there that can be built upon. But in general, it is a pretty weak picture, and it contrasts with the revivals that happened. I mean, again, as with the vote, the number of seats doesn't rise very much during the period of Labour government, and then it erodes again during Conservative government. So, where are the London Conservatives? As I suggested, they have been sort of driven to the edges a bit. That the strong Conservative areas are all at the edge of London. Now, this map looks different from how it would have looked in sort of 1979, when there were some reasonably strong Conservative areas in sort of middle-class parts of inner London, Dulwich, Hampstead, Hornsey, etc. So I'll explain the shading if people want me to, but I think for now I'll just pass on. It should be obvious. So what causes these problems? I think the top cause is just broad social, economic and political trends. I mean, to what extent it is a specific London thing, I think we may be tempted to overstate how specific to London it is. For a start, London is not alone. Most other large cities, European capitals, world cities, have swung to the left over the last 20 years. Mainstream conservatism finds it difficult to win elections in big cities now. The exception, the sort of most interesting exception possibly, is when you draw a bigger region around the capital, as you do in the sort of at the regional level in Spain and France, where although the left runs the core city, the right runs the region around it. And also the decline in the Conservative share in London, it's actually not that much faster than the decline in the Conservative share in Manchester, Glasgow, Liverpool, Birmingham, etc. Conservatives are generally weaker in urban areas across the world. And there, you may want to discuss why that is and what the British Conservatives can do. So the main moving parts for London, demographic change. the demography of London has changed a lot, and it's changed particularly much in some key constituencies. Edmonton, I think, is always quite a good example. It looked like becoming a safe Conservative seat for a bit in the late 80s, but it's now different sorts of people live there. And on top of that, you've also got political change in that, as I say, the sort of people who lived in Battersea in 2010 were going to vote Conservative, a lot of the ones who come into Battersea. They're less sympathetic now, essentially, for political reasons, but also these broad trends, graduates, knowledge, finance workers, etc. And I think there's also this factor that London identity seems to be moving away from the Conservatives a bit. The bits where the Conservatives are strongest are the least Londony bits of the London administrative area. We've got more young people, some statistics there. Median age in London, proportion of people aged over 65 in London is 12%. In the UK as a whole, it's 20%. Now, when the Conservative vote is heavily dependent on 65 plus people, that's a problem for the London Conservatives. You've got a group with 64% Conservative support, but they're severely underrepresented in London because it's a young city. Likewise, graduates have generally gone off the Conservatives, whereas people with fewer educational qualifications have rallied round the Conservatives. London is a lot more graduate-y, a lot more young than the nation as a whole, and these are precisely the groups that have headed away from the Conservatives. Ethnicities, another matter. London becoming steadily more diverse. Conservatives, again, this is something I'm sure will come up for discussion, that making some progress, but fairly slow progress. I think actually you might be doing better than the polling statistics suggest, because there are particular difficulties in getting representative samples with different communities. The other thing, political choices. Basically, there's a pretty nearly linear relationship between the Remain vote in 2016 and Sadiq Khan's vote in 2021. That cleavage hasn't gone away. Also, there's messaging. Something's got to give. I mean, the Conservatives have had a very successful realignment of the forces across England in particular. They've gained a lot more in votes and seats than they've lost, but London's the bit they've lost. From a cost-benefit analysis sitting in Downing Street, you can probably write off London. And indeed, the number of people out there in the rest of England who actively hate London means that there are advantages in not being too nice to London and having them to kick around. Is it healthy, though? A question. Levelling up. Londoners aren't as hostile to the idea of levelling up as I thought perhaps they might be. There seems to be a broad, no firm conclusion as to what it actually means for London. Young people in London, by the way, are consistently optimistic and think it's going to help London. There's a choice here as to whether to include London in levelling up, or whether to do the thing that sort of other countries have done, like to punish the big city for being politically bad, as they do in Hungary. 2021 elections. This is the swing in the mayoral election. You can see Labour, Sadiq Khan doing well across southwest and central London compared to last time, gaining ground in the suburbs. Heavy swing to the Conservatives, though, in some of the more traditional working class areas of London. The Enfield, Lee Valley corridor, out along the Thames to the east. And the Conservatives generally did quite well in terms of swing, in terms of making progress in the mayoral election in zones 4 and 5 of the tube map. You may, again, wish to discuss why that might be. The 2021 election had some sort of fairly well hidden upsides for the Conservatives. The Conservative vote was stress tested in these elections in London, and the mayoral contest in particular, but the share of the vote went up by 0.3%. That's not bad. Sean Bailey's campaign did show some ability to connect with people's gut issues and to persuade some people who particularly in Black and minority ethnic communities, that actually Conservatives are worth a shot. There was some helpful mobilisation of sort of the non-Londony things about London, like cars, suburbs, nostalgia. There are some little fragments of the Red Wall in London, like Dagenham, for instance, possible parliamentary gain next time. And it just also shows that London isn't completely detached from the rhythms of political life in the rest of England. Conservatives did well across England in the local authority elections. They did wellish in London, made a bit of progress at the assembly level. And the other side, the downsides for Labour. Labour's coalition of support is huge and varied and diverse, and it should be possible to chip bits off it, unless you're doing other things to repel voters. Different minorities, differences of view, differences of interest. I mean, Labour's support at the sort of top and bottom of the social spectrum in terms of there's a implicit conflict between the sort of people who own second houses and the sort of people who rent, who live in rented housing. So Labour's coalition is broad and should be kind of fissile, possibly. Turnout, can Labour keep people turning out at the rate it has done? 2021 elections suggested possibly not. Centre-left vote possibly splitting with the Greens coming up. I think the Greens might be kind of quite a major factor in London's electoral politics. And you've also got the sort of same thing as you had in Red Wall areas, that Labour's the municipal establishment in quite a lot of London. So there are some things to get hold of. There's some stuff to get your teeth into there. On the other hand, it's a long-term project. I think the next election is a hard one because the Conservative vote has gone up nationally in every election since '97. Are you going to increase it any more? It would be a big stretch to do it, but it's also a big stretch to kind of build on your support in a weak area when you're going down nationally. And there's also what happens to London. How will COVID affect London? How home working, transport, possible loss of status of London as a prestige world city. I mean, world cities aren't sort of entitled to keep their position forever. And also London's tentacles spreading out into the southeast. If Aldershot and Worthing and places like that are going Labour, maybe some bits of London will start trending back Tory again. Cities always surprise us. There are so many moving parts, and I look forward to hearing what you think might be on the way. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Lewis. Fascinating. And I'm struck just listening to all of that there are sort of two schools of thought. I think when for those of us who make a living being obsessed with London, which I include myself there. Obviously, I'm a board director at a firm called London Communications Agency, where we. And I see myself very much as a kind of supporter of London and somebody who is obsessed with kind of I suppose backing and endorsing the growth of this city for the good of its people. But I sort of am very struck by do we think of London as this homogenous whole, and is that helpful in any way? Because clearly in what you've shown us, there are lots of different ways that you can cut London, inner, outer, or just into its various wards, which are densely packed and there's a huge inequality across the city. And sometimes I think, when we talk about the sort of levelling up agenda and all of that, we do ourselves a disservice in recognising that variety. But then, of course, we want to make the case for the city and for, parties across the political spectrum, as well as others, to kind of give London its due and its credit. And I'm sure Tony will talk a little bit about that, because I know that's something that, he's worked long and hard to make sure is on the right people's agenda. But before we turn to Tony, I want to introduce our first sort of responder, I suppose. Stephen Hammond, who's the Conservative MP for Wimbledon, has been since 2005. And Stephen, I suppose, as a Conservative politician, but also someone who is, in a London constituency with a fairly tight majority, I suppose, your seat perhaps embodies some of these issues that the Tory party here faces. So I wonder sort of, how does Lewis's presentation make you feel, and how do you approach that as a London MP as well as a Conservative politician?
Well, Jenna, thank you. I mean, I was fascinated by Lewis's presentation. I had a chance to have quick look at it before he gave it this evening, and I think there were some really interesting parts of this which certainly reflect my part of London, but offer the challenges for us as Conservatives to try and find in London. I mean, I think his moving parts slide was fascinating as well, because it encapsulated what he'd been saying. Young professionals, many in high-tech, high-skilled industries, London becoming more educated. The increase in BAME community, but making the point also, which I have observed on the doorstep, that actually that's not closed to the Conservatives, but actually we haven't found the right sweet spot to increase the numbers. I think, and the challenge about how we engage with the increasing number of people who work not in the private sector or work in the third sector or the public sector. And the point that interestingly he made about Battersea, and Justine will appreciate this as well, was that those people instinctively, for many years that he described in Battersea, were Conservative voters, and they've stopped being instinctively Conservative voters. We need to ask ourselves why. And I think we moved around the question, but we have to face the fact that to win the 2019 general election, and probably since Brexit, we've been perceived as more nationalistic. We've also been perceived as perhaps less educated, more authoritarian, and probably outside London, appealing to a more working class agenda. And I think, therefore, the question we have to ask ourselves as Conservatives, and this starts to go on, and this feeds through, I think, into the next slide, is that I really picked up on, was if you run against London. It's a basic human emotion that if you think someone's against you, you want to make sure whether it's true or not. But if you perceive people are against you and the policy is being designed as against you, and the empathy is not there, then it's unsurprising that all of those potentially non-instinctively, people who are not necessarily instinctively anti-Tory, have become that way. But the point I think that was being made is that this can change and could change, and that brings me on, I think, to the slide which showed a number of things. But I think increasingly, some of the things that we have to start is being honest with ourselves about where we are and what our realistic perceptions are. The realistic prospects for us are. And it seems to me that if we want to rebuild ourselves in London above the 32%, and at the times we have built it above the 32%, and I think particularly of the time when Boris was mayor, and also at other times where we rebuilt, and David Cameron's election in 2010, where you saw a relatively small gap, I think sort of 11%, if I'm right, Lewis, against the 34% gap now. The challenge for the Conservative Party is to hold on to its donut and build inwards, not outwards anymore. And that seems to me to be, first of all, one of the challenges, I think, is to re-establish that some of the values we hold as Conservatives are not misaligned with a number of those areas, despite the perception at the moment there is. Secondly, I think there's always this, do you think like us? Can we trust you test? And I think that part of the problem was that the way we changed as a party, and particularly the perception of the leader of the party, shocked a lot of people between 2016 and 2019. And that now faces a problem for us in terms of rebuilding that trust. I think that, but I think like you, Lewis, I think there are some real opportunities for us, but we just have to be realistic of what they are. Firstly, I think that one of the things that the pandemic has shown us is that communities are becoming a lot more local. And so you talked about the rise of the Greens, but the rise of the community politician as an activist means that there are all sorts of things that we can do at a very, very local level. It seems to me, for instance, if I look around my constituency, some of the local high streets are more important than Wimbledon town centre in terms of where people look to at the moment, because if you're working from home, you go down to the local high street. And therefore, people who are seen to be building from the bottom upwards, empathetic with local community, standing up for some of those, recognising that there is now a challenge in terms of the quality of life arguments, because work versus that quality of life challenge and what you might do to rebuild your community. So at a very local level, Conservatives traditionally around the country are very good at that and have always been so. I always remember, it's a long time ago, but William Hague's point about, if you look around the country, it's not just the left wing that are involved in charities. It's not just the left wing that are involved in community activism. We, the Conservative Party, are. And so your point, Jenna, about it being a very diverse city and a very local city, as well as a big regional city, I think really plays into that. And we have to work out how we do that. You use the phrase municipal establishment. I use the phrase Rotten Borough. There is an issue, I think, in terms of confront for Conservatives to recognise that in a lot of London boroughs where the Labour Party are incredibly strong and we have had almost no representation, if we build upwards, we can also make the fault that actually it doesn't have to be like this. And some of that area, I think, is really key. The other thing, I guess, the two other things I want to make before I finish it. One is, you don't just say it, you have to do it. And I think your point on levelling up is really interesting. I mean, Justine is the expert on this, so I won't steal her thunder, but she and I have obviously talked about this a lot. And she won't mind me saying that, I think that one of the reasons why in your slide, Londoners aren't opposed to levelling up is, first of all, actually, many areas of London, including my own, parts of my own, need levelling up. And what it means is creating opportunity. So she knows, she's heard me say this. I mean, my view is if levelling up is good for Wigan, it's good for Wimbledon. And frankly, therefore, Londoners and we, the London Conservative Party, should say this is a great national policy. It applies in London as much as else. And it applies to our core value because one of the key principles of being a Conservative is creating opportunity. So it seems to me that's a really big opportunity for us. And also I think that if you're looking at some of the other things that where we perhaps have been weak over the last few years is creating some of the economic opportunities or portraying where the mayor has failed to produce some of those economic opportunities in comparison to other metropolitan regions and delivering that economic change and economic zones. I'm sure we'll talk about housing and skills and other things later. And the final thing I just wanted to mention is that the Conservative Party in London is an incredibly antiquated party. It's organisationally, it's poor. It hasn't adopted many of the modern methods. We still have very false breakdowns between we operate. We've got too many little groups. We have a voluntary party that isn't aligned always with the political party. One of the things that the Conservative Party needs to learn, I think, is its organisational strategy needs to get into the 20th century, and then might even jump into the 21st century. At the moment, we're still seem to be a long way behind. And I look in awe at times the way London Labour organises itself and gets its messaging across. And it does it really well because it gets the regional message, but actually managed to drill it down into some of the local borough and community messaging as well. And we are still a long way from learning that. I know that there's lots more to say, but I think that's my 7 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. There's lots to digest in there, and I think I agree with what you're saying about the sort of the Labour ground game and what the Conservatives can probably stand to learn from it. I also think just Lewis showed that slide about sort of left of centre parties tend to do better in cities, and I contrast that to your sort of optimism for where the Conservative Party could get to in London if they did things well. I mean, I wonder, and maybe we'll come on to discuss this a bit with the Q&A, but I sort of plant this now, whether we'll see a bit more divergence between what a sort of London Tory looks like versus a kind of, an other or a northern Tory, if you like, in the same way that you sort of see now with the Labour Party. Well, I think there's probably
we built a coalition of voters for the Conservative Party beyond the 32%. I think Lewis is right. We've got to be realistic about where we are, and that's going to be tough next year, and I suspect at the next general election. But if we don't start to think about how we do it and what are the ideas that do it, then not only will we be stagnating at 30%, given the demographic trends he pointed to, that 30% will only go down. And that's, I think, what I'm trying to highlight is that we need to be thinking about how we build back to get to the coalition of people who voted for us at other times when we did better in London than 32%.
And I think you rightly, and Lewis also points out the sort of importance of some, key issues, Brexit being probably first among them, but also the levelling up agenda. And at some point, I'm going to ask each of you to define what levelling up actually means, and particularly what it might mean for London. But Justine, that feels like a good moment to bring you in. So for those of you who don't know, Justine is the former Conservative MP for Labour. She stood down just before the 2019 election. And is the founder of the Social Mobility Pledge and chairs the Levelling Up Goals project, which I'm sure she might tell us a little bit more about too. But Justine, I think you're perfectly placed therefore to kind of talk about those particular issues, as well as those other points that Stephen and Lewis have raised.
Well, thanks very much, Jenna. Just a really fascinating presentation from Lewis to really, I think, set out just the different layers of where we find ourselves today. And then, Stephen, I agreed with everything Stephen has just said, giving a very local view that I recognise from our part of London that we're no doubt both sat in right at the moment. And I think I'm gonna be like Stephen. I'm going to be actually optimistic about our future fortunes in London, because I think we should be. And I genuinely believe that if we can take this city's priorities and make them ours, then we can win. And I think fundamentally that's the right way to win. And what are the city's priorities for London? I think London needs a levelling up plan. And when we were using that phrase, when I was at education, for us, it was about places, but it was also about people and different communities. And it wasn't just about the North, it was the national agenda. And I think we need to bring that levelling up agenda alive to what is an incredibly diverse city. But fundamentally, the reason for that is levelling up was about achieving equality of opportunity. And for me as a Conservative, that was really the bedrock of what I have always felt the party stands for. But some of those gaps on opportunity are the widest here in the capital. So it's absolutely relevant to London, whether it's gaps on wealth and income, whether it's gaps on being able to get on the housing ladder, whether it's gaps for certain parts of our city and certain communities for whom key professions feel like they're just simply out of reach. They literally can see them. If you're growing up in Greenwich, you can see Canary Wharf, but it might as well be miles away. Kids growing up on the Alton Estate, literally just half a mile away from me. Coming through what have been improving schools in London, but still feeling like they're locked out of many of the opportunities that this city has. So those were all problems that were there long before COVID, but I think in many respects have become more challenged since COVID. So probably the part of London's economy that was the most open, which was its hospitality, its tourism, its retail, all of the cultural side of the city, those have been the jobs that we've seen really go and are probably the most challenged by the changing working practices of the city. Of course, all of the City of London centre perhaps that's going to keep on going irrespective of what's happened, the professional services, the lawyers, the city, those perhaps are the sectors that have traditionally been the most closed to this diverse city. And so in a way, our levelling up challenge is a really stark one, but it's one that we should grab. And it's because, for people like me who weren't born in London, we came here because it was a city that offered opportunities to people, in many respects. From my perspective, I felt it was a place where I could really build a future for myself. And I was able to do that. And so I think for me, London also illustrates that, we often through the course of last year talked about levelling up in terms of infrastructure, roads and rail, but actually this is a city that's got plenty of roads, plenty of rail, plenty of public transport, but it doesn't feel like a city that's levelled up. And that's because levelling up is about a lot more than just the physical infrastructure that we all use day to day. And perhaps for London, if you do see more working in local areas and people spending much more time where they live, actually may become less important in many respects in the future than it's been in the past. And Jenna talked about the levelling up goals. And the levelling up goals is effectively the work that I've been doing with businesses, with universities, with civil society to really break down levelling up into its constituent challenges. There are 14 levelling up goals that we've identified that we need to address if we're really going to shift levelling up wherever you are in the UK, and that includes here in London. Some are around education, some are around connecting up to opportunities and progressing in work, and that's where businesses come in. And some are around very different things like health, whether you're on the right side of the digital divide, the kind of housing that you've got, of course. And so I think what it all boils down to is, for us as Conservatives, we have to have levelling up as our mission for London, and then set about articulating how we're going to bring that alive. And I think you can probably do it at different levels. One is, we are in government, and there are a lot of public sector jobs in London. And if we think it's right to level up by moving some Treasury jobs out of London and up to places like Darlington, because that's where perhaps more working class people are and those jobs will be good for them in time, well, there's probably going to be 90% of Treasury's jobs still here in London. So actually Treasury should also be bringing forward, and government should bring forward, a plan on how it's going to make all of those thousands of civil servant jobs right on our doorstep more accessible to more people who are actually living and growing up in this city. So whether it's people or whether it's procurement spend, government should be walking the talk when it comes to driving levelling up with its own organisation and with the civil service and with departments. I think similarly with City Hall, it should be bringing forward a much more coherent levelling up plan that takes those 14 levelling up goals and really breaks down how we can make sure they're achieved across the entire city. I think we've got borough elections next year, which are probably a golden opportunity for incoming councils of whatever colour to set out their local levelling up challenges and how they are very different in very different places. If you look at education, which I often hear people saying and talking about as if somehow it's fixed here in London, but if you're in Croydon, where more disadvantaged young people are coming out of our education system literally nearly 17 months behind their better advantaged peers across the rest of the country, it doesn't feel like education's leveled up here. If you're part of an ethnic minority community that actually may well be coming out of our education system in the capital, well educated now, with aspiration, but feeling like you're locked out of too many companies that really aren't even close to being representative of the city that we're all part of, again, it doesn't feel like levelling up's happened to you. And I think, as Stephen talked about, there are these micro communities. So the challenges in my constituency that are represented in Roehampton are very different to the ones perhaps that people face in Southfields. So I think it's about really being determined to achieve levelling up for London, but behind that having a really set of practical steps that we can put in place that give people a sense that we're not only determined to do it, we actually have a game plan for how we achieve it. And I think one of the questions that we were going to talk about, I think, on this webinar was why that isn't just important for London, why it's important for everywhere else. And of course, London is a massive contributor to the public purse to invest nationwide, not just in the city that we're all sat in at the moment, but actually we're invested in London in levelling up happening across the rest of the country, because actually the more those other regions themselves are able to create opportunities and provide those on the doorstep for people growing up there, then actually the less that means London itself needs to contribute, if you like, to a wider levelling up plan across the UK. And actually we can collectively grow the pot for everyone. And my final comment would be, I think we need to be really clear as a Conservative Party in London, but as a city, that levelling up isn't a zero-sum game. When you create more opportunities for people wherever they are, that's how you create more opportunities, full stop. It has a multiplier effect. And therefore, London doing better is good for everyone. just as much as my hometown where I grew up of Rotherham in South Yorkshire doing better, being better for them. It's not a zero-sum opportunity. Equality of opportunity is something we need to achieve for everyone wherever they are in the country, but that absolutely has to include London.
Thank you, Justine. Lots of fodder there, and I'll bring in Andrew in a second, because obviously he's very well placed to talk about what our tier of regional government can do against this agenda. But I'm sort of struck that we sort of seem to be using levelling up here as a sort of proxy or shorthand for just generally investing in and trying to generate better outcomes for people, which seems like a pretty decent role for government generally. And I just wondered, Justine, if you could just comment on how do you think that we can reconcile, Lewis made the point that we sort of, it's highly possible that we have a government who's looked at the sort of cost benefit analysis of the London kind of election strategy and gone, actually, you know what, we don't need it. So we can focus our energy and our messaging elsewhere, and we can kind of, in his words, write off London. How do you reconcile that with your, laudable goals to then attract investment and opportunity to, whether it's the whole capital or whether it's those pockets that, Croydon, whether it's for education or Wimbledon or wherever it is. But, how do you, as the sort of London wing of the Conservative Party, then make that case to central government?
Well, I think there's probably 3 points. One is that the Chesham and Amersham by-election showed that there are voters outside of the north, and they also care about what happens in their local area, and that includes opportunity. And so that's the first thing. The politics do have to be national, and I've never believed that it's either right or smart to write off whole swathes of this country for any reason. I think that is wrong, and I think it's divisive. Secondly, I think that London Conservatives can, in a sense, I guess, take a leaf out of those Red Wall Tory playbooks. I mean, they've done a brilliant job of articulating more collectively for their region, and good luck to them. Well done for them for actually being able to coordinate that message and really get it through. But there's no reason in my mind why London Conservatives can't do that. I know it's been hard, and I've been part of those discussions, and I know as an MP, as Stephen does, and Andrew as an Assembly member, the day-to-day stresses and strains on your role and all of that. But I think we have to now speak with much more of one voice. And then I think finally, in terms of this, it's not all about government. A lot of London's levelling up challenge is whether the businesses that have the opportunities in this city are prepared to think more collectively and more strategically about the role they play in extending those opportunities to a really diverse city and playing their role in our education system, building the career capital, all the stuff that young people need to be able to thrive when they get the chance to have those opportunities. So this isn't, for me, just about galvanizing more investment in London. That's part of it. It's also about galvanizing a wider city of our businesses, of civil society, to collectively work on levelling up the capital.
Thank you. And Andrew, as you've been an Assembly member since 2008, chair of the London Assembly, chair of the Planning and Regen Committee as well. So wearing lots of hats, but particularly as a kind of, you do represent the whole of London. Perhaps that marks you out amongst this group particularly, and have done for some time. And I wonder about your the role of regional government here, and also the relationship, I think, between our tier of regional government such as it is, which perhaps isn't as powerful as in other cities, and the relationship between what is now a Labour-held tier of government against, if you like, a Conservative central government. And that's a difficult dynamic. I think we've seen that ever increasingly more so difficult over sort of Sadiq's tenure. But I wonder what your perspective is on all of this from a kind of your role within that tier, but also at London-wide.
Well, the problem is that we're not doing regional government very seriously. Incidentally, if I whistle halfway through my speech, it's because I broke off a tooth last night on a homemade hobnob, which goes to show that you shouldn't try to cook stuff at home, really. Anyway, the problem is that we're not doing regional government properly, and we can see this from things like the TfL settlement. We can see this from things like the bizarre plans to reform planning in London, and actually planning matters a whole lot more in London than it does to areas that got loads of green fields around them. It's actually more important than here than in the pastoral idyll that is mostly represented by Conservative members of Parliament. So these kind of destructive measures, which are taking place with the minimum of consultation, initial consultation with London members, means that we will continue to run up against problems when it comes to trying, at a local level, trying to defend some of the more bizarre decisions of government. And the reason is systemic. And thank you, Stephen, for doing my speech earlier, you rotter, because there was, I do think this has got something to do with the organisation of the London Party. You know, I've been in the party since Disraeli led it. And I still, to this day, do not understand how the party works in London. It's this weird mix of sub-regional and regional representative bodies, never sure who the chair of the London Party is exactly, except she wrote me a nice email the other day, so I do know who it is. But it's always been this sort of rat's nest of links between different parts of the party. And the result is that we organisationally are a very weak party in London compared to the rest of the country. We don't have the ability, like the Labour Party does, to produce 25 or 30 young people on the street to do a canvassing session. We find that really hard. And it's because we have no real regional structure that can direct those kind of initiatives. You know, and regional government is important. It's absolutely vital, and I think there should be more of it. Well, at least I think London should be a bigger bit of it, and it's far too small to, I mean, I'm not going to resolve this problem by the next election, but it's far too small a body to truly represent the massive economic impact that, or the economic footprint that London is on the southeast. And, you know, all this levelling up agenda about everything going to the north, you know, I could not stand for election outside London because I've been too rude to Conservatives outside London, because they whine constantly about London gets this, London gets that. And I say, fine, you whine away about how dreadful London is, but just give us our money back, because we are subsidising your rural idylls. This is where we make the money. And you spend it. Okay, I'll give Southeast region a free pass, but apart from that, the rest of the country spends our money for us and then spends most of the time complaining about it. Well, we need to have a resolution that is London-based. What saved, you know, Theresa May from complete humiliation in 2017 was a very active and distinct Conservative Party in Scotland that had its own voice. Didn't mean it wasn't Conservative. It didn't mean that it was a completely separate party, but it had its own distinctive voice. And we do not have that in London. We do not have a metropolitan narrative about the things that are important to people. Whilst I agree with Stephen, you know, in terms of geography, we've got to start the building back of the Conservative Party from obviously those areas where we are strong in the suburbs. But in terms of politics, we've got to fight from the centre, because, you know, fighting from where we are at the moment, fighting from the right, we get white van man, we get the people living in the nice suburbs, and those kind of voters. You know, we're kind of going to get them anyway. We've got to start addressing those people who voted for Sadiq Khan last time. We have to understand why they made that choice rather than the choice of the Conservative government. And Sean Bailey ran a mostly great campaign and managed to capture areas of London that previously had been very difficult for us to get into. But let's not believe all the stuff that the opposition says about us, especially on things like engagement with ethnic minorities. You know, we had a real crisis in Barking and Dagenham selections back for the 2018 elections. We sat down and we looked at our candidates that were standing up for us in Barking and Dagenham, and we realized we didn't have enough white people representing us. Now that's a London problem, which we addressed, may I say, but it's a London problem. It's not about picking on particular ethnic minorities. It's about being a party that looks like it represents the whole of London, that has the voice of the whole of London. And that means we must place ourselves firmly at the centre of London opinion, even if that occasionally means that we have to stand up against our party nationally. Because at sometimes that distinctive voice will want distinctive policies. Unless the government's going to come forward and recognise the powerhouse that is London, start giving us the powers. I mean, I think it's ridiculous, for example, the level of centralisation we have in the UK. It's like we're giving Sadiq Khan all his excuses. Sadiq Khan, objectively, the worst mayor we've ever had. He's completely messed. Difficult to think of another Labour politician who would do a worse job than Sadiq Khan has done. And yet we've lost against him. And one of the reasons we lost against him is because we gave him all the excuses. Because we are so centralised, Sadiq Khan was able to say there's not enough police on the streets because of government funding. Transport isn't working because of government funding. We're not building enough houses because of government funding. Now, I can spend an hour with you proving to you that that is not the case, but we actually gave him his excuses by the way in which we devolved power in London. So many more things I wanted to say, but I've gone on far too long already, and perhaps I can answer some questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Very passionate there. And I wonder if I could just perhaps bring in Justine and Stephen before I turn to Tony to kind of sum us up before we go to the Q&A. But let's say, for example, I'm so fantastic at my job as a PR and communications consultant that by 2023, I've rounded you up hundreds and hundreds of young London Tories who are willing to get out there and knock on doors and hit the phones and you know, play kind of the Labour ground game as you've been talking about. You know, you're very passionate about the need to do that. What are they saying? What are they saying to voters? You know, what between the sort of you three as London Conservatives, what are your top one or two issues that you think actually could speak to you know, the potential Conservative voters of London, with very much in mind, you know, Lewis is sort of showing that stagnating line around the 32%.
I think Stephen had it earlier when he pointed out that the Greens were worrying the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is worried by the Greens to the point where they kind of managed a bit when we were allocating chairs on the London Assembly. They managed a walkout, effectively, not taking out their responsibilities to chair some of the committees. And it was obvious, anybody who's done student politics it was obvious that what they were doing is leaving the chairs of the committees to the Conservatives, the Lib Dems and the Greens. And it was clear that this tactic was they then want to go around sticking leaflets through doors saying, if you vote Green, you get Tory. That's how worried they are. And Stephen was so right that where the Greens have appealed to Labour voters and where we do when we carry it through is they are willing to listen to what those voters are saying. The Labour Party is not a listening party. It is incapable of translating what it hears on the doorstep into action, because if it goes against their perceived wisdom. So I would say, personally, those young people going round, they should talk about us being the listening party, being the ones who are going to take on their concerns. And I know that sounds straightforward, but the Labour Party don't do that.
Before we get too party political, I'll bring in the calm, calm manner of Professor Tony Travers to, I think, probably pull this together and send us into the Q&A with some considered thoughts. Tony, I'm heaping the pressure on your shoulders. But for those of you who don't know Tony, he's director of LSE London and the research centre at the LSE that looks at all of this sort of thing. Tony, I'm not used to introducing you because everybody normally knows exactly who you are, but I hope I've done a decent enough job there. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much. And first, I've enjoyed this evening enormously. Lewis's excellent presentation, all the other contributions from politicians. And the reason I'm so enthusiastic about taking part in this event is that it's important for London that the Conservative Party does better than it has, in the way that it's important for Britain that Labour does better than it has across the country. We live in a kind of democracy where it's essential that the party that's out of power has a good chance of winning next time. That's how this system works. And unless it does, we end up with one-party states at the borough level. That's not to attack the individual leaders of those boroughs, but it's not helpful for democracy. This point has been made earlier already. So that's the first thing I'd say. I think it's important that we consider in any part of the country where there is no real chance of electoral competition, that there is such competition. So for that reason, I think this, and the reason why that matters is, and we've already bumped up against this already this evening, you slightly get the impression that the Conservative Party doesn't try very hard in London. I'm not saying anybody around this table. And because of that, the Labour Party doesn't have to try very hard either. And that's not good for London. Actually, it's not good for the country. That's the first thing. So sort of building on that, another obvious observation, what might the Conservatives do? And Andrew's just touched on one of my thoughts, but the first thing, I was talking to Jenna's colleague Robert Gordon-Clark about this earlier, the very first thing the Conservative Party needs to do is to make sure it doesn't lose any more boroughs next May. I assume that some effort is being made to stop Wandsworth and Westminster falling into Labour hands. I haven't seen much evidence of it yet, but the truth is the Labour Party won the popular vote in Wandsworth last time. Chances of it not going NOC are vanishing as time goes by, I would have thought. And the Conservatives almost lost the popular vote in Westminster last time. Now, in fact, the only really safe London borough, I mean, I totally take Lewis's analysis, but oddly, Bexley is really the only really safe one left. It's the only one that Conservatives are doing better in over time. Kensington, Chelsea's rock solid, Hillingdon probably. But interestingly, the Conservative is doing slightly better in what you might call Brexity boroughs than in its traditional sort of centrist parts of the city, but we'll just park that for another night. So I totally agree with Andrew about the need for a separate party arrangement with a different brand. I think the Scottish Conservatives did this brilliantly. I think Ruth Davidson was absolutely excellent at it. Obviously still a Conservative, much loved by Conservatives across the United Kingdom, or England, Great Britain, by the way, but able to articulate a completely different and on occasion totally oppositional message to the mainstream English Conservative message. So I think that can be done. We know it can be done within the United Kingdom. That's the first thing. I think the Conservatives need to choose a mayoral candidate early next time and get that person in situ as an opposition. It's only going to be a 3-year term. Now it's only 2.5 years. Get a candidate early with a view to building up and actually having them supported. Sean Bailey, who I totally agree did do rather well, did well partly on his own. He didn't have much support from the Conservative Party nationally. So it needs to have a candidate in place, building up some momentum for some time before the last few weeks. Then there's MPs. I'm sorry to say this with Stephen and Justine on the line. And of course, you're both wonderful. But I do think Conservative MPs in London, I know, Justine, you're no longer an MP, but you know what I mean. In a sense, Conservative MPs in London need to convey the sense that they are, perilously close to creating a London research group to counter all the other research groups out there that represent Conservative interests in different parts of the country for various reasons. And, it cannot be sensible to have ended up with a levelling up policy where, and I always used to say, and I still do say, the thing that divided Conservatives in some ways from Labour politicians is that Conservatives never believed in levelling down. They always accused Labour of that. Well, we're perilously close to a world in which not building the Bakerloo line extension through Walworth is seen as part of levelling up. Or we're going to be levelling up from the part of the country which has the highest unemployment to places where unemployment's 2.5%. There are ways of making that case, but I don't really, Justine, I know you are working on this, and Stephen, I know you are too. But the truth is that Conservative MPs as a group, over 20 of them in London, with Assembly members, council leaders, could articulate these points, I think, far more effectively than they have before. I think the Conservative Party could become the party of London again. If you think of about its core tenets, freedom, enterprise, getting on, quite how a party that believed in those things can't appeal to migrants who've come from all over the world to make their lives in London, or graduates who've done that from the rest of Britain in many cases, or business people who want to have enterprise and good conditions to work. It's no small achievement to have failed to manage to put so many of them off. So there's a potential there for the Conservative Party, it seems to me. And as Justine said, fighting for the left behind in London is an easy goal, an easy win for the Conservative Party, because we're this close at the moment, as I've said before, from conveying the idea that we have to level up from the rich of Barking and Dagenham to the poor of Harrogate. Now, it's not like that. There are loads of people in London. If you're on a median income in London, it's not much higher than the median income for Britain, but your life chances are much lower. These are simple messages to get across. So I think there's great opportunity. One final thought is that Frank Luntz's work, which has had some publicity recently, in the depths of his polling, it shows there's much less worry about London and the South and the North-South thing than we often come to believe. I think there are many, many more issues that people in Britain worry about. So I think that convincing the rest of the UK, and London, by the way, has a role to play in this, that London and the United Kingdom, or London and Britain, or London and England are the same place, or have enough common characteristics to hold together in a common national endeavour, is something London Conservatives could easily get across to an expectant and doubtless hopeful nation, or country and city, I should say, in this case. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. And I thought I'd just pick up before we turn to the Q&A, and please do send in your questions now. I know we've got about half an hour for some Q&A with the panelists. But you rightly sort of mentioned that the upcoming elections, so the local elections next year, and then the mayoral election in 2024. And I wonder to our panelists, and perhaps Justine, you might chime in first here, but if you were, and perhaps you are, having conversations with Rachel Rowbotham at Westminster, or Rami Govindia at Wandsworth, who's probably looking at some of those stats that Lewis has shown us, and feeling a little bit concerned about what happens next year. What do they do, sort of policy wise, in concrete terms, to shore up the Conservative vote in those sort of flagship Tory boroughs in central London?
Well, I think it's three things, isn't it? One is having a clear vision for what they want to do at a local level, and as I've said, I think it's about how they bring alive that levelling up agenda and what it means in some very different London boroughs. I think the second thing is activists and local Conservative parties have to be visibly working on those priorities. You can't just say you care about stuff, but then not actually do anything about it. And then I think on the back of that, you can start to genuinely mobilize people. And I think we should literally see those borough elections as a chance to make a difference by having more people out and about and engaging people in a political process, which, as Tony says, they want the choice. And actually, the reality is people are less tribal now politically than they've been in a long time for all sorts of reasons. And they want to hear what we have to say in terms of our solutions. And I think, Labour, we saw Labour in the rest of the country not doing as well, because fundamentally, I think their challenge is maybe people don't really know what they stand for. I think half the battle is having a very clear-cut sense of what we are trying to accomplish for the city and in individual boroughs. And I think if you can get that, that is a big step forward. And I think that's what people want to see too.
Stephen, I know you wanted to come back on a couple of Tony's points and perhaps add to what Justine has just said.
Well, unsurprisingly, I support what Justine just said. And I think, interestingly, in some parts of London where we have stronger organisation, then that's happening. Certainly my group, my constituency group go out very regularly, but to Andrew's point, listening, asking what are the things that are affecting you. I think Tony's criticism of London MPs was absolutely spot on, actually. We failed to act as a group for a while. We've failed to get some of those core messages. We've failed to work with other elected politicians in London to get, not only us, but collectively to get a message across. So, I mean, Tony will probably not be surprised to hear, therefore, that I've taken the initiative and reset up the London Conservative MPs group, because I think he directly takes that challenge. And we're going to work with Andrew. I've already been speaking to Susan Hall and Teresa O'Neill. We need a much better London message. I mean, I accept it's regionally, and as Justine says, what works in Wandsworth will not necessarily work in Barking, but actually showing the Conservatives standing up and doing that for you. I think that's key. And I think actually there's a lot to hit current mayor on, and a lot to make positive noises about holding the councils we hold. And part of that, plays into, yes, having the right vision, having the right policies, proving we've done it, doing it, but also means we do need some organisation. And one of the things in London at the moment, putting a bit of that back together so that we can make sure we keep those councils.
Sorry, Tony, of course.
I'm not sure, this is me speaking now, not you. I mean, Labour MPs are not so great either, if I can just balance this up a bit, speaking for London. And so that also begs the question of the all-party approach by MPs in London, which, somebody who's regularly been to speak to all-party groups from Yorkshire and Humberside and the Northwest, they are very active, and it's partly because they're further from London. I get that, and perhaps London MPs don't feel the need to act corporately, or almost in a sense that London's so successful, but we've just all agreed it needs lots of levelling up help. Individuals and households do anyway. So, I didn't want only to attack Conservative MPs, because I do think there's a sort of broader point here.
Sure, and I take that point, but I just wanted to I think that some of the criticisms you make of myself and my colleagues is spot on, and we need to be thinking about how we work with other elected politicians in London to coordinate a message. I think the Labour Party do it better. I take what you say. I think the problem with all parliamentary groups, as you well know, is that they're successful on issues that are non-party political. So there's a fairly successful group on Crossrail, for instance, but inevitably in the London group we get into some fairly chunky political agreements pretty quickly, and that impacts. Whereas, as you talk about, some of those regional groups are looking at particular projects for those regions, and I think that's why it's been less effective than it could or should have been.
Andrew, I think you wanted to come in.
I think in terms, they're on. You see, we on the London Assembly, the Conservatives maintain a distinctive voice. We produce reports that aim to focus Londoners' attention on London issues, on a wide range of areas. You can see all those at glaconservatives.co.uk and hit the reports button, and you'll see the kind of stuff that we're talking about. But one of the things that we do know on the Assembly, and has been very useful, is knowing the power of working with other parties. After all, we want their votes. So we want to know how they're thinking, what they represent, and come to a consensus with them. And on a whole range of issues, for instance, on planning reforms, there wasn't a cigarette paper that you could put between me and Nicky Gavron on the importance of proper reforms to planning, on hitting our global warming targets and all the rest of it. And there was virtually no difference between us. And where we worked together, it worked really well. But we had a London focus. I'm not going to tell off MPs. It's not my job to tell off MPs. But what I will say is that over the years, we've tried repeatedly to have these groups together of trying to get MPs and councillors and assembly members together on a regular basis. And it works for about 3 months, and then it all fizzles out again, and then we come back and start it all over again. So we're missing something there. And I think the thing we're missing is a strong London party. And that a strong London party structure. That is something we could do. And I think that that's something that we should start banging the table about, actually. You know, the trouble is with us Tories, we're dreadfully loyal to the party. Whoever's in charge, we're loyal. I think we've got to be I think we've got to make talking to the London party a bit more uncomfortable for the people at the centre, to be honest. We're pushovers at the moment.
I think you'd find the Labour Party wishes they had a little bit more of that loyalty sometimes. Just a question from one of our audience members, Dwayne Brooks, which just follows quite nicely from that, Andrew, which he's asked what was missing in the last mayoral elections for the Tories that would have enabled the Conservatives to attract more votes from other parties. And I would like to just extend that question slightly and you know, can we answer it without using the phrase levelling up, and think about, I think, you know, what the actual sort of, you know, I think Lewis and others have raised interesting points about sort of where votes could come from, for example, from the Greens and Liberal Democrats. So I wonder whether we can kind of think about that question quite specifically when it comes to London issues and London electoral maths.
I think where we missed out last time is we had a very good programme to talk to our usual core voters. But in London, it's not about core votes, it's about more votes. And that's what we didn't pursue as well as we could have done. And we should have set ourselves at the centre of London politics. We should have had a unique Conservative strategy on air quality, on transport, on incredible failures that Sadiq Khan has had on things like house building, and come up with the Tory narrative. We did to an extent, but it looked like the people we were trying to appeal to would probably already vote Conservative anyway. So that's what we need to do. We need to get into the mind of people who currently don't vote for us. And those quality of life issues, as I said, I think I'm doing a circular thing, they are more important to Londoners, to people who live in cities, than they are to people who live in the country, because they've got an abundance of good quality life, to be honest, of good environmental quality. And if you think that that's an impossible thing to do, you just need to look at the example of Andy Street in the West Midlands. He's done himself proud, a fantastic result in an area that you wouldn't normally have called Conservative. And he did so because he addressed those very concerns. In fact, I think his election leaflets were all green. So, I mean, he made that distinctive voice for the West Midlands, and that's something that we need to do here. Sorry.
Tony, I wonder if you could sort of chime in, thinking about, you know, you noted about the sort of, is it healthy for the Conservative, you know, for a sort of any party to write off a particular part of the country, and I suppose not, you know, in a sense, not have a kind of accountable opposition. And Nick Bowes, Chief Executive of the Centre for London, has asked a sort of question around that, which is, yeah, and he's come at it in an interesting way. So he said, you know, firstly, how much is the sort of, I suppose, political sort of culture war that we see and I guess played out in the press harming the Conservatives in London, but actually also the other way, does it harm does it push London, as he says, to assert its power and influence and demand more autonomy and retention and more of its own money? Might we see a London autonomy populist movement, which I sort of like the sound of, but I wonder if you can sort of comment on you know, I suppose that's a sort of macro view of some of the trends we've been discussing.
Oh, there's no question autonomy, devolution, real autonomy and devolution of the kind met in other countries could profoundly alter this. You know, if mayors of London and or London boroughs were setting income tax rates, I suspect you get quite a powerful turnout around a new kind of culture war between high and low tax rates, which has sadly completely disappeared since there's virtually no tax and it's mostly capped. So, but on the broader issue about culture wars, I mean, in fairness to everybody here tonight, and I was a bit critical earlier on, and Lewis knows this better than anybody, the kind of overlapping stepped culture wars that have been unleashed on us now are such that it is very hard for political parties, Conservative as much as Labour and the Lib Dems, to find positions that are going to, they're not going to appeal to 47% of the electorate across the country any longer. The only hope is you can get them to about 15 or 20%, and that the other 85% don't care too much. And that, that's the way we're headed. And I mean, just a culture war issue, Theos, the religious think tank, produced a fascinating study last year about religious belief in London. Now, I'm not a religious person, but I do find this intriguing, showing that, of course, large numbers of people in London are quite socially conservative. They are socially conservative. And as far as I can see, I'm not saying necessarily social conservatism is my preferred way forward, but I can see that there's a way of parties responding to people's deep held cultural beliefs while still holding on to core values of liberalism and democracy and so on, which both the Conservative and Labour Party are going to have to try to achieve looking ahead. They're going to be squaring off circles carefully all the time from now on, particularly in a place as large and complex as London.
I think you're so right, Tony, and I was thinking of Harrow when you were speaking as actually somewhere that Sean Bailey did quite well in May, and I think there are those sort of cultural, socially conservative pockets, particularly around particularly certain communities in that area where we've certainly sort of, I think we can probably infer that some of that has played out. And we've had a question from one of the participants today, or one of the audience members today, asking about how Conservative politicians can appeal to those perhaps socially conservative, also possibly minority, sort of belonging to minority group Londoners. So I think, I don't know, Stephen, if that's somewhere where you could kind of talk to as a sitting politician.
Yeah, but can I just go back and pick up one of your question to Andrew Boff as well about, I think Andrew rightly pointed out some of the things that went well in the mayoral campaign, but I think one of the things there was no offering, and it's a concern for me and a number of my colleagues, is we used to be the party of enterprise, we used to be the party of business, we used to be standing up, and one of the things, as I think Justine's pointed out, is, and I won't use the phrase because you were told us not to, but the whole part of her agenda, it's not just government, the private sector has got to be involved in driving those opportunities as well. And I think one of the things that we missed in May was any sense of where we were going to move away from what Khan was putting forward to allow business to thrive in London. And I think that was a core part of our message missing, particularly, obviously see more what I see in my own area, but I've got a huge micro economy of high tech firms, who want to employ more people, who want those sort of incentives, who want to get on and thrive. And I don't think we had any message to that. And London, is as Andrew talked about a moment ago, the wealth generator of the country. It permeates out from here. If we're not supporting the wealth creators in London, we're not supporting them in the country. And we do need to have that message as the next part of our quite distinctive, I think, Conservative agenda. Where I think we need to think about our appeal, as you talk to some of the more socially conservative groups, I always, when I get asked, what's one of the principles of being a conservative, and Tony laid a few out, but one of the others surely is, that the family block, the family unit in a modern sense being the core of how you build societies, and a lot of groups I think believe that, and by that I don't mean the traditional, 2 parents, 2 children block, but I think a stable opportunity, a stable lifestyle for people is one way of appealing to that group. I think the other thing that clearly, as someone said earlier, many of the people are small business people, or want to see the traditional you hope your next generation does better than you. Those are the classic conservative values. And finding a way around the policies that work that, I think, is probably our best way of appealing to those groups. And I think Sean picked up clearly a theme that resonates across the whole of London. And I think the problem for a lot of us was it became almost the only theme we came for. But clearly, we as politicians, one of our first obligations is to make sure citizens feel safe and are safe. And I think that sense has moved a bit in London, quite a lot, in fact, increasingly away, I think. And so I think making sure that we continue with that message, but broadening that message out, is a pretty good place for the next mayoral candidate to start.
I wonder, we've had a question that I think probably links to that feeling of safety, which is about how the introduction of the new voter ID laws will make a difference. And I suppose there's a couple of different facets to that question that, Lewis, maybe you might want to start with. I think turnout is obviously sort of an important aspect of that equation, but obviously also there's a sort of policy and political issues to consider as well, and some of the sort of the tropes that we've been talking about today around those perhaps more socially conservative, likely Tory voters within minority groups may feel perhaps alienated or even disenfranchised by that law. A sort of open question, I think, to all the panel. But Lewis, perhaps we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the sort of way that voter ID is being done, to be honest. I think it's a particular issue. I mean, I'm not saying there's been very little kind of decent research into how real the problem actually is, particularly with in-person personation, which is the only thing that photo ID is supposed to be good for. There's no doubt that it happens occasionally, and usually in sort of particular kind of enclosed insular communities of whatever nature. And the pilots that took place a couple of years ago suggested that it was picking up next to no genuine personation, and it was putting people off. Now, the people it puts off tend to be people whose lives aren't particularly settled. They've moved house, they're young people, they don't drive. There's quite a lot of people who don't drive, of course, in London. It's a sort of, it feels like a sort of slightly punitive thing on, and also, even if you can get an ID from the council, you usually have to do it a month or two in advance, I think. It's a bit of a sort of disenfranchisement, I mean, targeted at people whose lives are perhaps a bit sort of disorganized. And maybe I kind of feel particularly for that kind of person, because I'm a bit disorganized myself. I think there's nothing terribly wrong with it as long as you kind of cover the bases and get people ID. It's one of these problems that actually a very unfashionable view all round that ID cards would have solved quite easily. Could have had a little sort of entry on the barcode or the chip as to whether somebody has the right to vote or not. Very easily done. I think the way we do registrations probably technically a very long way round in terms of matching people to addresses and matching people's voting rights to their identity. So I'm not convinced by voter ID. These kind of technical fixes don't make any difference really beyond that. I mean, we're talking at most about 0.5% or maybe more. I mean, what sort of I always think of is Northern Ireland when they introduced it in sort of 20 years ago. And yeah, a lot of dead names disappeared from the register. It didn't actually affect the election results much. So either there was much less cheating than the folklore suggested, or each side was doing it roughly in proportion to how many real voters there were, which kind of defeats the point. So, as I say, I don't think it's any kind of solution to these problems. And I think you don't want to, I mean, there are arguments one way or the other. I'm not keen. You may be keen for good reason. but you shouldn't delude yourselves that it's the solution to any kind of problem. That way lies the kind of way the US Republican Party goes. You gradually sort of voter ID, photo ID doesn't work, so let's sort of slimy slice voting hours or whatever. You don't want to go that way. And it's not a solution. It's not an alternative to a political strategy that works.
We're almost out of time. I've got one last question asked by Jack Brown, who I think probably a few of you know. That he writes that London has a higher percentage of graduates than other parts of the country, much like other cities. And why does the panel think that graduates, so specifically because of skilled, aspirational, potential high earners, are so much more likely to vote Labour, or at least not Conservative? And how would you address this as part of the sort of strategy of the future Tory party? Justine or Andrew, do you want to start?
Oh, housing. Just housing. You know, you attend to housing. I've got this thing about, you know, London's always going to be unequal. All right, it always will be unequal, and long may it be unequal, because people come to London because they want to improve. They want to realize those aspirations that they've got. So by definition, they tend to come in at the bottom and work their way up. So if we ever become equal or too leveled up, I won't use that phrase too much, because then London isn't performing its job. But the biggest problem for people when they come to London is to find accommodation. And we're not dealing with it. We're not building the kind of homes that people need. We're not building the kind of homes that graduates should be occupying. We're not building the kind of homes that families, more importantly, need. And that, for me, is the big issue, and it is resolvable. And that's why it's terrible that we didn't win the last mayoral election, because we could have solved it.
Justine, sort of from a social mobility perspective, does that chime with you? And do you see that as the reason that perhaps sort of aspiring graduates, I suppose is how we put it, tend to vote not Tory?
We're meant to be the party of effort and reward. And for too many graduates, that link is broken. They've invested in getting a degree, and then there isn't the high skill job for them when they come out of it. No wonder. And it is bonkers, but that's the challenge we have to fix in London. And it's what I was talking about before. It's the fact that there are some great opportunities in this city, not enough of them, but even the ones that are there don't feel like they're open fairly to the talent that this city has. Great book, by the way, Jack. I would recommend everybody reads it. But these are the actual issues. And as Andrew says, housing as well. This is a city where there are too many barriers getting in your way of getting those opportunities. And fundamentally, what we need to do as a party is work out how we remove them so that people can fulfill their potential. And if they can do that, then London can fulfill its potential.
That's a perfect moment for me to ask my final question for each of the panelists. So in turn, if you had to pick a candidate now for 2024 to win back the mayoralty for the Conservative Party, who would you pick? Andrew, I'm going to pick on you first.
I'm going to vote for me. I've already declared I'll be a candidate.
Okay, so let's assume we're all giving Andrew our first preference vote. Justine, might we be giving you a vote too?
I think we have to go for somebody that genuinely can help level up Britain and drive that agenda, and that people see as credible in doing that. End of.
You don't have a name in mind. I won't press you. Tony?
Well, it might be good for one of the major parties to try with a female candidate for once. And against that backdrop, somebody who was very visibly, sorry, Andrew, sorry, I'm not ruling you out, obviously. Somebody who was keen on sort of social mobility and understood the London political scene. That's the kind of person I think that probably the Conservative Party may need to look for. I will name no names.
I think we all see where you're headed there. And Stephen, finally with you.
Well, the only thing I'd add to Tony's thing is probably a generational shift as well. Let's look at, we talked about the young aspirants in Battersea several times, but they're young aspirants across London, and I think probably a sense of fresh enthusiasm and fresh vibrancy might be one of the things. Not that Andrew hasn't got all of those, but I'm not. I think it's difficult to pick a.
Oh, we've gone on mute.
Sorry, difficult to pick a name at this juncture.
But as Tony said, we might want to think about picking one sooner rather than later this time around. Thank you all so much for participating. Thanks to everybody who asked questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to every single one of them, but I think through the course of the evening we've touched on quite a few of the points raised. Lewis, thank you very much for your fascinating presentation, which I believe the Mayoral and London Institute is very happy to share, if that's okay with you. And finally to Patrick and Sophia from the Mayoral and London Institute for organising this evening. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I was struck finally by Andrew's little soundbite, which I probably am going to claim for myself, which is that it's not about core votes, but it's about more votes, which I rather like. So I'll leave us all with that little pithy phrase, and please all do enjoy the evening and stay dry.
Thanks. Night all.
Thank you.